The polar vortex. That's all you've got to say, and people get nuts. They get crazy, right? Well, actually, that all started in January 2014, happened again in winter of 2021. And in both cases, we had an Arctic outbreak, and meteorologists started using the term polar vortex. Well, the news media and folks in social media really latched onto it. There was a lot of hype around polar vortex. It even scared some people. So I want to set the record straight on what the polar vortex really is, okay? Now, first of all, the polar vortex is something that meteorologists have been studying as far back as the late 1940s, early 1950s, and the polar vortex is actually something that is just a basic feature of the Earth's climatology. So it's not something that is new, okay? Now, the first thing we want to do in understanding the polar vortex is to take a look at a couple of terms. One is the term troposphere. Troposphere refers to the lowest 5 to 9 miles of the Earth's atmosphere where our weather occurs. And above that is the stratosphere. That's 10 to 30 miles above the Earth's surface, okay? So troposphere, 5 to 9 miles above the Earth's surface, that's where weather occurs. And then stratosphere, which is 10 to 30 miles above the Earth. Now, this is what you typically would see, let's say, in the news or in social media. There's this massive polar vortex over the North Pole, and it's going to drive southward, bringing an Arctic outbreak to the central and eastern United States, right? You're going to hear something like that. But that's kind of incorrect, and at best, it's an oversimplification of what's really happening. And that's because the polar vortex, as you'll see here in a moment, actually sits 10 to 30 miles above the North Pole, and it's surrounded by strong winds that contain it. It's this bank of cold air with a belt of strong winds around it, and it generally stays in place, although it can get off kilter, can get disrupted, and we're going to talk about what happens in those situations. Now, the next feature I want to point out is the polar jet, and that's in the troposphere. The polar jet is about 5 to 9 miles above the Earth's surface. As I said, in the troposphere, that is what basically drives our weather systems and air masses across the United States and around the world during the winter time. So the polar jet you can think of as a dividing line. Even though it's high up in the atmosphere, it basically is a dividing line between the cold air to the north and the warmer air to the south. So now let's talk about the polar vortex. As I said, the polar vortex is something that's very stable. It forms in the fall and lasts through about the springtime here in the northern hemisphere. It's a bank of cold air that is surrounded by a strong band of winds. Now, the polar vortex, again, as I said, very stable. But what can happen is it can become disrupted. And when the polar vortex becomes disrupted, it can actually break out into a couple of different lobes here. So the polar vortex, where originally was over the poles, has now basically become off kilter with a couple of different lobes in this example. And when this happens, it can interact with the polar jet in the troposphere and drive Arctic air here into the United States. Now, what's important to point out is that not every disruption to the polar vortex results in an Arctic outbreak here in the United States. It's also important to point out that we don't always need a disruption to the polar vortex in order to have an outbreak of Arctic air here in the US. Now, one of the things that's causing confusion is that many people are referring to the polar jet, which is up in our troposphere, 5 to 9 miles above the Earth's surface, as a polar vortex. But wait a minute, we've got the polar vortex up here in the stratosphere, right? 10 to 30 miles above the North Pole. So are there really two polar vortexes? Well, I asked this question of Dr. Amy Butler, who's at the NOAA Chemical Sciences Lab. She is one of the world's foremost experts on the polar vortex, and she says absolutely not. We should not be referring to the polar jet as the polar vortex. The polar vortex is that bank of cold air that sits 10 to 30 miles above the North Pole in the stratosphere from the fall through the spring. Boy, that was a lot of information, so let's do a very quick review. Number one, we learned that the polar vortex is in the stratosphere, 10 to 30 miles above the Earth's surface. The polar jet is in the troposphere, 5 to 9 miles above the Earth's surface. And there can be a disruption to the polar vortex where there's an interaction between the polar vortex and the polar jet such that we get an Arctic outbreak here in the United States. And that disruption to the polar vortex allows us the opportunity to forecast as much as weeks in advance that there is the potential for that Arctic outbreak. Now, just because there is a disruption to the polar vortex does not mean we are necessarily going to have an Arctic outbreak. At the same time, we can have an Arctic outbreak here in the States without a disruption to the polar vortex. Now, the last item here, SSW, sudden stratospheric warming. That's right, yet another term for people to go nuts about, just like they did with polar vortex, right? Sudden stratospheric warming is just like it sounds, where there is a sudden warming of the stratosphere, and that can signal a disruption to the polar vortex. That's right, meaning that there could be an Arctic blast for us here in the US sometime in, let's say, the coming days or weeks. So there you go. There is yet another term for people to get crazy about, but I hope you enjoyed this one. We'll see you for the next video.